Hello, my dear friends. In the Middle Ages, the papacy was not only a religious office, but one of the most powerful political positions in Europe, controlling land, wealth, armies, alliances, and influence that reached far beyond the walls of Rome. To understand why so many medieval popes became scandalous figures, it is important to understand that the papacy existed in a world where spiritual authority and worldly power were completely entangled, and where holiness was often spoken about more than it was practiced. The Pope was believed to be God's representative on earth, yet he lived in a world of kings, nobles, rival families, and constant political violence. And this combination created conditions where corruption, excess, and scandal became almost inevitable. During the early and high Middle Ages, becoming pope was rarely about spiritual merit alone. Powerful Roman families treated the papacy as an inheritance, a prize to be fought over and controlled. Elections were influenced by bribery, intimidation, and outright violence. Armed men surrounded churches during conclaves. Rival candidates were imprisoned, exiled, or murdered. In such an environment, the kind of men who reached the papal throne were often skilled politicians rather than humble clerics, and once in power, they ruled accordingly. Many medieval popes lived openly luxurious lives that shocked even their contemporaries. They occupied grand palaces, surrounded themselves with servants, mistresses, and relatives, and spent vast sums of money on banquets, art, and personal comfort. This wealth came from church taxes, indulgences, land rents, and political deals. While ordinary Christians were taught humility and restraint, the highest leader of the church often lived more like a king than a shepherd of souls. Sexual scandal was one of the most common and controversial aspects of medieval papal life. Despite official rules requiring celibacy, many popes kept mistresses openly and fathered children. These children were not hidden in shame, but were often acknowledged, educated, and placed into powerful positions within the church. Nepotism became so widespread that it shaped the very structure of medieval Catholic leadership. Popes promoted sons, nephews, and cousins to cardinalships and bishoprics, ensuring that power remained within family lines rather than being guided by spiritual calling. Some popes became infamous for their behavior even by medieval standards, which were already more tolerant of excess than later generations. There were popes accused of hosting orgies in the Vatican, of selling church offices to the highest bidder, and of using their authority to protect criminals and allies. Accusations of murder, poisonings, and sexual abuse circulated widely, recorded by chroniclers who were both horrified and fascinated by what they witnessed. These were not isolated rumors whispered in secret, but widely known scandals discussed openly across Europe. The political role of the Pope made corruption even more tempting. Popes negotiated treaties, crowned emperors, declared wars, and excommunicated enemies. Excommunication was not merely a spiritual punishment. It could destabilize kingdoms, justify rebellions, and strip rulers of legitimacy. Some popes used this power ruthlessly, not for moral reform, but to advance personal or family interests. Rivals were condemned not because they were sinful, but because they were inconvenient. One of the darkest aspects of medieval papal scandal was the use of violence. Assassinations, forced imprisonments, and armed conflict were common tools. Rome itself was often a battlefield, with rival factions fighting openly in the streets. Popes sometimes relied on private armies for protection and retaliation. In this environment, moral authority weakened, replaced by fear and political calculation. Ordinary believers were not blind to these contradictions. Many medieval Christians were deeply troubled by the behavior of their spiritual leaders. Satirical poems, critical sermons, and angry letters reveal widespread frustration with a church that preached holiness while practicing excess. Yet open resistance was dangerous. The church controlled education, law, and salvation itself. Criticism could lead to charges of heresy, imprisonment, or death. Despite this corruption, the institution of the papacy endured. Scandal did not destroy it, partly because there was no alternative authority capable of replacing it. Faith in God remained strong even when faith in popes weakened. People learned to separate belief from leadership, enduring scandal while hoping for reform that often came slowly, if at all. The medieval papacy therefore existed in a constant tension between sacred image and worldly reality. Popes were expected to embody Christ-like virtue while navigating a brutal political landscape that rewarded ambition, ruthlessness, and compromise. Many failed spectacularly, leaving behind stories that shocked contemporaries and continue to fascinate historians. And as the centuries passed, scandal did not fade. It evolved, growing more elaborate as papal power increased, setting the stage for even greater excesses, deeper corruption, and conflicts that would eventually shake the church itself. As the medieval centuries moved forward, papal scandal did not remain an occasional failure of character, but hardened into a pattern shaped by power, wealth, and survival inside a violent political world. The papacy sat at the center of Europe's struggles, and every major family, kingdom, and faction understood that controlling the pope meant controlling legitimacy itself. This made the office a target, and it also reshaped the kind of men who could realistically hold it. Spiritual restraint rarely survived contact with this level of influence. Rome during the Middle Ages was not a peaceful holy city. It was unstable, dangerous, and frequently ruled by competing noble clans who treated the papacy as a prize. Families such as the Tuscolani and the Crescentii fought openly for control of church offices. Armed supporters guarded candidates. Bribes flowed freely. Elections were rushed, manipulated, or forced. In this environment, popes learned quickly that survival depended on alliances rather than virtue. Some of the most scandalous behavior came from popes who viewed the church as personal property. Church offices were openly sold in a practice known as simony, named after a biblical figure condemned for attempting to buy spiritual power. Bishoprics, abbeys, and even cardinalships were exchanged for gold or political loyalty. This drained the church of competent leadership and replaced it with those who could pay, deepening corruption at every level. Sexual scandal became impossible to hide. Despite official bans on clerical marriage and sexual relationships, many popes kept mistresses openly. Chroniclers recorded children born within papal palaces, raised with privilege and later promoted into high office. Nepotism was not subtle, it was systematic. Popes elevated sons, nephews, and cousins to positions of immense power, ensuring family dominance long after their own deaths. Violence also marked this era. Some popes ordered assassinations or approved violent retaliation against enemies. Rivals were imprisoned in monasteries, blinded, or executed. One pope was accused of murdering his predecessor. Another was reportedly poisoned. The papal throne itself became dangerous to occupy, with several popes dying violently or being driven from Rome by force. Perhaps the most shocking moment of medieval papal scandal was the Cadaver Synod in 897, when Pope Stephen VI ordered the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, to be exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and placed on trial. The dead pope was accused, condemned, stripped of his vestments, and thrown into the Tiber River. This event horrified contemporaries and revealed how far the papacy had fallen into political madness and personal vendetta. Other popes were notorious for excess and cruelty. Some were accused of turning the Lateran Palace into a place of constant debauchery. Others were said to have used spiritual authority to protect criminals and silence critics. While not every accusation can be proven, the volume and consistency of contemporary reports show that scandal was not imagined. It was experienced. The Church attempted reform repeatedly, but reform was slow and fragile. Councils condemned simony and sexual misconduct, yet enforcement depended on the very men benefiting from corruption. Even sincere reformers struggled against entrenched interests. Each attempt at moral restoration was followed by relapse, as political pressure overwhelmed spiritual intention. Ordinary believers responded with a mixture of outrage, resignation, and separation. Many criticized popes openly in private letters and sermons, yet continued to practice their faith. The distinction between the holiness of God and the corruption of his representatives became a coping mechanism. Faith survived even as trust in leadership eroded. By the later Middle Ages, papal scandal had contributed directly to wider crises. The Avignon papacy, where popes lived in France under heavy royal influence, deepened perceptions of corruption and favoritism. The Great Western Schism, with multiple rival popes claiming legitimacy at the same time, shattered the image of a unified church and exposed how political the papacy had become. These scandals did not destroy the medieval church, but they permanently changed it. Authority weakened. Criticism grew louder. Reform movements gained strength. What had once been whispered became openly discussed. The behavior of scandalous popes planted seeds that would later grow into profound challenges to church power. As papal scandals accumulated across generations, the behavior of individual popes began to reshape not only the reputation of the church, but also the daily political reality of medieval Europe. The Pope was no longer seen merely as a distant spiritual guide. He became a central political actor whose personal flaws could trigger wars, rebellions, and long-term instability. When scandal entered the papacy, it did not stay private. It spilled outward, affecting kings, bishops, monasteries, and ordinary believers alike. One of the most damaging aspects of medieval papal scandal was how openly power was abused for personal security. Many popes ruled in constant fear of rivals. Rome was unsafe. Noble families switched loyalties quickly. A pope who lost protection could be imprisoned or killed. To survive, popes rewarded supporters aggressively, granting land, titles, and church offices to allies regardless of merit. This turned spiritual leadership into a marketplace of favors and loyalty, where corruption became a survival strategy rather than an exception. Financial exploitation deepened the damage. Popes imposed heavy taxes on clergy, sold indulgences, and demanded payments from rulers in exchange for political or spiritual favors. These practices funded lavish lifestyles and military defenses, but drained local churches and monasteries. Parish priests struggled while Rome grew richer. This imbalance fueled resentment, especially among lower clergy who were expected to enforce rules they knew the highest authority ignored. Moral hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. Popes issued decrees against sexual misconduct while openly maintaining relationships themselves. They condemned greed while accumulating wealth. They preached humility while living surrounded by luxury. Chroniclers of the time, many of them loyal churchmen, expressed deep discomfort at this contradiction. Their writings show not rebellion, but heartbreak. A sense that the institution meant to guide souls had lost its way. Scandal also weakened the Pope's ability to discipline others. When corrupt popes attempted to correct immoral behavior among clergy or rulers, their authority rang hollow. Kings challenged papal commands more boldly. Bishops resisted interference. The idea that the Pope stood above reproach slowly eroded. Respect remained, but fear replaced reverence in many cases. Some popes responded to criticism not with reform, but with repression. Critics were silenced through accusations of heresy. Political enemies were excommunicated. Entire regions were placed under interdict, cutting off access to sacraments as punishment for defiance. These measures were powerful, but they also revealed how far spiritual tools had been transformed into political weapons. The sacred became strategic. The wider Christian world watched these events closely. Monasteries recorded them. Universities debated them. Reformers emerged, arguing that the Church could not heal society while remaining morally compromised at its center. Yet change was slow because the papacy remained embedded in European power structures. No ruler wanted a weak pope if they could control a strong one. Over time, scandal reshaped expectations. People no longer expected popes to be saints. They expected them to be skilled rulers. Holiness became a hope rather than an assumption. This quiet shift altered the meaning of religious authority itself, creating a gap between belief and leadership that widened with each generation. By the later Middle Ages, the cumulative effect of scandal had damaged the Church's moral foundation. Faith endured, but trust fractured. The papacy remained powerful, yet increasingly contested. What had once been shocking behavior became familiar, even anticipated. Scandal lost its ability to surprise, and that normalization marked one of the deepest consequences of medieval papal corruption. As the Middle Ages stretched onward, papal scandal stopped being an interruption in history and became a background condition of the Church's highest office. What once shocked now exhausted. Chroniclers no longer wrote with surprise but with weary detail, recording corruption as something expected rather than extraordinary. This shift is important because it shows how deeply scandal had settled into the structure of the medieval papacy itself. The problem was no longer a few immoral men. It was an office shaped by power so absolute that restraint rarely survived it. By this time, the Pope controlled enormous wealth. The Church owned vast lands across Europe, collected rents, tithes, and taxes, and received gifts from kings seeking favor. This wealth was supposed to support spiritual work, charity, and the maintenance of churches. But much of it was diverted to sustain political ambition. Papal courts became lavish centers of influence filled with advisors, soldiers, lawyers, and family members. Luxury was not hidden. It was displayed openly as a sign of authority. One of the most corrosive scandals was the systematic sale of church positions. Simony became so common that entire dioceses were effectively bought and sold. Bishops paid Rome to secure their office, then recovered their investment by taxing their clergy and congregations. This created a chain of exploitation that ran from the papal palace down to the smallest parish. Spiritual leadership suffered because positions were filled by those with money and connections, rather than moral or intellectual ability. The moral authority of the papacy weakened further when popes used excommunication as a political weapon. Excommunication was meant to be a grave spiritual punishment, separating a person from the church and salvation. In practice, scandalous popes wielded it to punish enemies, intimidate rulers, and force compliance. Kings were excommunicated not for sin, but for defiance. Entire regions were placed under interdict, cutting off sacraments to innocent populations as leverage in political disputes. This weaponization of faith deeply disturbed many believers. Sexual scandal continued to undermine credibility. Despite repeated reforms and declarations, celibacy remained widely ignored at the highest levels. Papal mistresses lived openly in Rome. Children born to popes were acknowledged and promoted. Nepotism reached extraordinary levels with entire family networks embedded in church leadership. These practices blurred the line between sacred institution and dynastic power, making the papacy resemble a royal house rather than a spiritual office. Violence never fully disappeared from papal life. Some popes ruled under constant threat, surrounded by guards and fortifications. Others ordered arrests, imprisonments, and executions of rivals. Rome itself became unstable, with factions fighting for control of the papacy. At times, multiple claimants ruled simultaneously, each accusing the other of corruption and illegitimacy, while ordinary Christians were left confused and disillusioned. The Great Western Schism was the ultimate expression of this breakdown. For decades, rival popes claimed authority from different cities, each supported by different kingdoms. All claimed to be the true successor of St. Peter. All condemned the others. The scandal was not just moral, but existential. If multiple popes existed, which one spoke for God? The confusion damaged the Church's unity and exposed the papacy's dependence on political backing. Throughout all of this, reform movements struggled to gain traction. Councils condemned corruption, called for limits on papal power, and demanded moral renewal. Some popes attempted genuine reform, but they were often resisted, undermined, or replaced. The system rewarded ambition more reliably than holiness. Reform required restraint, and restraint was rarely advantageous in a political battlefield. For ordinary believers, this era required emotional separation. Many continued to practice their faith devoutly, while mentally distancing themselves from papal leadership. Saints, local clergy, and personal devotion became more important than Rome itself. Faith survived, but confidence in the institution weakened. Criticism grew louder, more organized, and more dangerous to ignore. By the late Middle Ages, papal scandal had reshaped Christianity permanently. The image of the Pope as a purely spiritual figure was gone. In its place stood a complex, compromised ruler whose authority rested as much on politics as on faith. This transformation did not destroy the Church immediately, but it planted seeds of doubt that would later grow into open challenge and reform. The medieval papacy endured scandal after scandal not because it was morally strong, but because it was deeply embedded in the power structures of Europe. Kings needed popes. Popes needed kings. This mutual dependence allowed corruption to survive long after its spiritual cost became obvious. As the medieval centuries deepened, the scandals surrounding the papacy began to harden into something more structural, less about individual failure and more about an institution shaped by constant pressure from wealth, warfare, and dynastic ambition. The Pope was expected to be a moral compass, yet he was also expected to behave like a prince among princes, negotiating alliances, funding armies, and defending territory. These expectations were not compatible, and the tension between them produced behavior that shocked believers while remaining completely logical. Within the political reality of the age, papal courts increasingly resembled royal courts. Diplomats arrived daily, bringing gifts, promises, and threats. Legal cases flowed into Rome from across Europe, each carrying fees and political consequences. The Pope sat at the center of this system, deciding disputes that determined borders, inheritances, and royal legitimacy. Such power invited manipulation. Bribery became normalized, not as corruption in the modern sense, but as a method of influence accepted by nearly everyone involved. Money spoke fluently in Rome, and those without it struggled to be heard. One of the most damaging long-term scandals was the erosion of spiritual credibility caused by constant financial demands. Taxes on clergy increased steadily. Monasteries were pressured to send money to Rome even when local communities suffered. Indulgences, originally intended as spiritual acts of penance, became financial tools used to fund papal projects and wars. This practice blurred the line between forgiveness and transaction, leaving many believers uneasy but powerless to resist. The behavior of individual popes often amplified this discomfort. Some were known for extravagant banquets, elaborate clothing, and personal indulgence that contrasted sharply with the poverty surrounding them. Chroniclers described feasts held while famine ravaged the countryside, and celebrations funded by money extracted from distant parishes struggling to survive. These contrasts did not go unnoticed. They were discussed quietly in sermons, debated in universities, and recorded in letters filled with restrained anger. Political favoritism further undermined trust. Popes regularly aligned with certain kingdoms while condemning others, not based on moral grounds but strategic advantage. Alliances shifted rapidly. A ruler praised one year could be excommunicated the next if interests diverged. This inconsistency weakened the perception of papal justice. Spiritual authority appeared negotiable, dependent on power rather than principle. Violence remained an ever-present shadow. Papal territories were defended by mercenaries. Enemies were suppressed through imprisonment or exile. Some popes ruled from fortified palaces, rarely appearing in public without armed protection. The image of a shepherd guiding his flock gave way to that of a ruler guarding his throne. Fear replaced reverence as the primary tool of control. Despite repeated calls for reform, meaningful change remained elusive. Councils attempted to limit papal authority and address corruption, but enforcement required cooperation from the very institution being criticized. Reform-minded popes faced resistance from entrenched interests that benefited from the status quo. Even sincere efforts often collapsed under political pressure, leaving believers increasingly cynical. The cumulative effect of these scandals was subtle but profound. People did not abandon faith en masse, but they adjusted expectations. Holiness was sought in local saints, monastic communities, and personal devotion rather than in Rome. The papacy remained powerful, yet emotionally distant. Respect lingered, but trust thinned. By this stage, scandal no longer shocked Europe, it tired it. The papacy continued to function, but its moral authority had been stretched thin by generations of compromise. The institution survived because it was indispensable, not because it was exemplary. And as this reality settled in, the gap between spiritual ideal and lived reality widened further, setting the stage for even greater challenges still to come. As the late Middle Ages approached, the accumulated weight of centuries of papal scandal began to alter how power itself was understood within the Church. The Pope was no longer simply a flawed man occupying a sacred office. He had become the visible symbol of an institution struggling to reconcile its divine claims with its earthly behavior. This contradiction did not explode suddenly. It settled slowly, shaping expectations, dulling outrage, and redefining what people believed leadership looked like. One of the most damaging consequences of repeated scandal was the normalization of moral contradiction. Medieval Christians grew accustomed to hearing sermons about virtue delivered by clergy, appointed through bribery, favoritism, or family connection. They learned to live with the discomfort of believing in sacred truths administered by deeply compromised institutions. This psychological adjustment allowed faith to survive, but it weakened the authority of those who claimed to represent it absolutely. Popes increasingly relied on legalism rather than moral example to maintain control. Canon law expanded, becoming more complex and technical. Authority rested less on holiness and more on procedure. Courts, documents, seals, and decrees replaced personal credibility. This shift protected the institution but further distanced it from ordinary believers, who found the Church's leadership increasingly remote and inaccessible. Scandal also reshaped education and debate. Universities became centers where clerics openly discussed corruption, authority, and reform. Theologians argued about whether obedience to a corrupt pope was still required. These discussions did not immediately weaken the Church, but they planted intellectual seeds that questioned absolute papal power. The idea that authority could be criticized without rejecting faith gained ground. The papacy responded to this growing scrutiny defensively. Critics were monitored, writings were censored, accusations of heresy were used to silence voices calling for change. This response protected short-term stability, but deepened long-term resentment. Reformers were pushed to the margins rather than integrated into leadership, making future conflict more likely. International politics further complicated matters. As nation-states grew stronger, kings became less willing to tolerate papal interference. Scandal weakened the Pope's ability to command unquestioned obedience. Excommunication still carried weight, but rulers learned to negotiate, delay, or ignore it when convenient. The Pope remained powerful, but no longer uncontested. By this stage, papal scandal had become part of Europe's political language. Accusations of corruption were used strategically by enemies and rivals. Moral failure became a weapon rather than merely a concern. This politicization of scandal ensured it would continue, as exposure now served interests beyond reform. The cumulative effect of all this was erosion rather than collapse. The medieval papacy did not fall apart in response to scandal. It adapted. It centralized authority. It fortified itself legally and militarily. Yet in doing so, It moved further away from the spiritual simplicity it claimed to uphold. The distance between ideal and reality widened until it could no longer be ignored. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Pope was still one of the most powerful figures in Europe, but the nature of that power had changed. It rested less on moral trust and more on institutional inertia. Faith persisted, but confidence fractured. Scandal had not destroyed the Church, but it had reshaped it permanently, leaving behind an authority that endured through structure rather than example. As the medieval world moved closer to its later centuries, the long shadow cast by papal scandal began to influence not only how people viewed the Pope, but how they understood the idea of authority itself. The office that once claimed to stand above all earthly power now appeared deeply entangled within it, shaped by the same ambitions, fears, and compromises that governed kings and nobles. This transformation did not occur overnight. It unfolded slowly, reinforced by repeated examples of behavior that contradicted the spiritual ideals the papacy publicly defended. One of the most significant consequences of sustained scandal was the gradual loss of moral distance between the Pope and secular rulers. Earlier generations had accepted the idea that the Pope could judge kings because he stood closer to God. By the later Middle Ages, this distinction weakened. When popes themselves were seen engaging in bribery, nepotism, sexual excess, and political manipulation, their moral superiority became harder to defend. Kings increasingly treated popes as rivals rather than spiritual overseers, negotiating with them as equals rather than submitting as penitents. This shift altered the balance of power across Europe. Monarchs began asserting greater control over their own churches, appointing bishops, collecting church taxes, and resisting papal interference. Scandal provided justification. A corrupt pope, rulers argued, had no right to command unquestioned obedience. These arguments did not arise from sudden disbelief, but from long familiarity with papal misconduct. Scandal normalized resistance. Within the Church itself, obedience also became more conditional. Bishops and clergy complied outwardly, but increasingly acted independently when it suited local interests. The idea that Rome knew best weakened as its behavior grew less defensible. Papal decrees were followed selectively, interpreted creatively, or delayed indefinitely. Authority persisted, but its grip loosened. Scandal also reshaped how holiness was imagined. Medieval believers did not abandon their faith, but they redirected it. Saints, relics, pilgrimages, and local holy figures gained importance as alternatives to distant and compromised leadership. Spiritual meaning moved downward and outward, away from Rome and toward personal devotion. This shift did not break the Church, but it diluted centralized control. The papacy responded by emphasizing ritual, law, and hierarchy even more strongly. Elaborate ceremonies reinforced majesty. Complex legal systems reinforced authority. Titles, robes, and traditions filled the space where moral credibility had thinned. These displays impressed observers, but they also reinforced the perception that power mattered more than purity. Some popes attempted genuine reform during this period, recognizing the damage scandal had caused. They issued decrees against simony, restricted nepotism, and called for moral renewal. Yet these efforts often failed because the structure itself rewarded corruption. Reform threatened too many interests at once. Resistance emerged quietly, effectively, and persistently. The system absorbed reform attempts without fundamentally changing. Meanwhile, critics grew bolder. Scholars, preachers, and theologians began articulating arguments that separated faith from papal behavior more explicitly. They insisted that divine truth could exist independently of corrupt leadership. This idea was revolutionary in its implications, even if it appeared moderate in expression. Once accepted, it limited the Pope's ability to claim absolute moral authority. Scandal thus became cumulative rather than explosive. Each generation inherited a slightly weaker version of papal credibility than the last. No single pope destroyed trust. Instead, trust eroded through repetition. Familiarity replaced outrage. Disappointment replaced shock. By the late Middle Ages, the papacy remained powerful but no longer unquestionable. It still crowned emperors, issued decrees, and commanded armies, yet its moral voice competed with many others. Scandal had transformed the Pope from a singular spiritual authority into one influential actor among many. This transformation did not end the medieval church, but it reshaped its future. The habits formed during centuries of scandal, compromise, defensiveness, reliance on power over example, would continue to influence the institution long after the Middle Ages ended, leaving a legacy that could not easily be undone. As the medieval period reached its final centuries, the long history of papal scandals settled into something quieter, but more consequential than outrage. It reshaped habits, expectations, and structures in ways that could not be easily reversed. By this stage, the papacy no longer shocked Europe by behaving badly. Instead, Europe had learned how to function around papal misconduct, adapting politically and spiritually to a reality where the highest religious authority was also deeply compromised. One of the most important changes was how obedience was practiced. Earlier medieval Christians had been taught that obedience to the Pope was a direct obligation to God. By the later Middle Ages, obedience became conditional, negotiated, and practical. Rulers followed papal commands when they aligned with political interest and resisted when they did not. Clergy complied outwardly while quietly prioritizing local concerns. The idea of absolute submission weakened, replaced by calculation. This shift altered the Church's internal balance. Power moved downward and outward. Local bishops gained autonomy. Regional churches developed stronger identities. National interests increasingly shaped religious practice. The Pope remained symbolically supreme, but enforcement depended on cooperation that was no longer automatic. Scandal had taught Europe that papal authority could be challenged without immediate spiritual collapse. The papacy responded by investing heavily in bureaucracy. Administration expanded, record-keeping intensified, legal structures multiplied. Authority became something proven through documents, seals, and procedures rather than moral trust. This transformation preserved control, but it also changed the character of leadership. The Pope became more administrator than shepherd, more judge than guide. At the same time, scandal shaped how ordinary believers related to the Church emotionally. Many developed a quiet separation between belief and leadership. God remained sacred. Scripture remained meaningful. Sacraments remained necessary. But popes were increasingly seen as flawed men occupying a necessary office rather than living examples of holiness. This mental division allowed faith to continue without requiring admiration. Literature from the period reflects this adjustment. Satire became sharper. Criticism became more sophisticated. Writers mocked corruption while affirming belief. This duality shows how deeply scandal had been absorbed into cultural consciousness. It was no longer disruptive. It was expected. Repeated scandal also affected reform efforts. Calls for change multiplied, but they often targeted symptoms rather than structures. Councils condemned individual abuses without dismantling the systems that produced them. This pattern created cycles of hope, followed by disappointment. Each failed reform further normalized compromise. By this point, papal scandal had influenced not just religion, but European politics broadly. Accusations of corruption became diplomatic tools. Rival powers justified resistance by pointing to papal misconduct. Moral authority, once a weapon of the papacy, was now used against it. This reversal weakened Rome's leverage even when its legal power remained intact. What endured through all of this was the institution itself. The papacy survived scandal not because it overcame corruption, but because it adapted to it. It learned how to function without trust, relying instead on tradition, law, and necessity. This endurance came at a cost. The spiritual simplicity that once defined the office was replaced by complexity and distance. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the papacy stood transformed by its own history. It remained central, influential, and powerful, yet fundamentally changed. Scandal had not destroyed it, but it had reshaped its meaning. The Pope was no longer the unquestioned moral compass of Christendom. He was a ruler navigating a world that had learned to expect imperfection at the very top. As the Middle Ages moved toward their final phase, the accumulated history of papal scandal began to influence not only how authority functioned, but how legitimacy itself was understood. For centuries, the Pope had claimed legitimacy through divine succession, an unbroken spiritual line reaching back to St. Peter. But repeated corruption weakened this claim in practice, even if it remained powerful in theory. People still accepted the structure, but belief in its moral purity had thinned to the point where obedience often came from habit rather than conviction. By this time, many popes ruled knowing they would not be loved or trusted in the old sense. Instead, they focused on maintaining control through alliances, administration, and symbolism. Ceremonies grew more elaborate. Papal titles multiplied. The language of authority became more formal and distant. These changes were not random. They compensated for what scandal had taken away. Where moral example failed, spectacle stepped in to fill the gap. The everyday operations of the Church reflected this shift. Decisions were slower, more bureaucratic, and more insulated from public scrutiny. Power concentrated in councils, courts, and inner circles of advisors, many of whom were chosen for loyalty rather than virtue. This insulation protected the papacy from immediate collapse, but also deepened the gap between leadership and ordinary believers. The Pope became less visible as a person and more visible as an institution. Scandal also reshaped memory. Over time, even the most shocking stories faded into a general expectation of corruption. People stopped reacting to individual excesses and instead accepted scandal as part of how the Church functioned. This acceptance did not mean approval. It meant resignation. Medieval society learned to live with contradiction rather than confront it directly. The persistence of scandal affected how history itself was recorded. Chroniclers became more cautious, sometimes avoiding direct criticism, sometimes expressing it through coded language or allegory. Others wrote openly, knowing their words might be dangerous. The existence of these records shows that awareness of corruption was widespread and enduring. Silence was not ignorance. It was often survival. As reform movements gained strength, they drew heavily on this long history of papal misconduct. Critics argued that corruption was not accidental but structural, produced by unchecked power and political entanglement. These arguments did not yet overturn the Church, but they changed the terms of debate. Authority could be questioned, leadership could be criticized, faith could be separated from obedience. The papacy, sensing this shift, responded by reinforcing continuity. Tradition became a shield. The idea that the Church had survived worse crises before was emphasized repeatedly. Scandal was reframed as temporary weakness rather than permanent damage. This narrative helped preserve stability, but it also delayed meaningful change. What is striking about this period is not how often popes failed, but how little the system changed in response. The same incentives remained. Wealth attracted ambition. Power invited manipulation. Fear encouraged secrecy. Each scandal resolved itself without addressing underlying causes, ensuring that the pattern would repeat. By the very end of the Middle Ages, papal authority still existed, but it rested on thinner ground than ever before. It was upheld by law, custom, and necessity, rather than moral clarity. Scandal had not destroyed belief, but it had transformed it into something more cautious, more distant, and less absolute. The medieval papacy entered the modern era carrying this legacy. The stories of scandalous popes were not forgotten. They became reference points, warnings, and arguments. They shaped how later generations understood power, corruption, and the limits of authority claimed in the name of the divine. As Europe quietly crossed from the medieval world toward something new, the papacy carried its accumulated scandals forward like sediment, layered over centuries. Nothing was wiped clean. Instead, habits formed during earlier periods continued to shape behavior almost automatically. Power, once normalized as something to be defended at all costs, rarely loosened its grip willingly. The Pope remained surrounded by advisors trained not in spiritual humility, but in survival within a dangerous political landscape where every weakness could be exploited. At this stage, the papal court functioned less like a religious center and more like a permanent diplomatic battlefield. Envoys from kingdoms arrived constantly, each representing interests that conflicted with one another. Every decision risked angering someone powerful. In this environment, compromise became routine, and compromise often meant moral ambiguity. Silence replaced honesty. Delay replaced reform. Scandal was not always created by excess anymore, but by inaction and quiet consent. The culture within Rome reflected this reality. Advancement depended on loyalty, family ties, and usefulness rather than virtue. Those who questioned corruption too openly found themselves isolated, transferred, or quietly removed from influence. This did not require violence. Exclusion was enough. Careers ended without explanation. Voices disappeared from councils. The system protected itself through control rather than confrontation. Financial practices also continued along familiar paths. Money flowed upward relentlessly. Taxes were justified as necessary for stability, defense, and administration. Little distinction was made between institutional need and personal comfort. The papacy had grown accustomed to wealth, and once accustomed, it became difficult to imagine operating without it. Calls for simplicity sounded unrealistic inside a system built on abundance. Scandal at this stage became diffuse. There were fewer shocking singular events and more constant low-level corruption. Nothing exploded dramatically, but nothing healed either. This made criticism harder. There was no single villain to condemn, no moment to rally around. Instead, dissatisfaction accumulated quietly among clergy, scholars, and rulers alike. Theological debate reflected this tension. Thinkers increasingly explored limits on authority, the role of conscience, and the distinction between office and individual. These ideas circulated cautiously but persistently. They did not immediately undermine papal power, but they reshaped how that power was understood. Obedience became something to justify rather than assume. Within monasteries and universities, discussions about reform grew more systematic. Writers analyzed patterns of corruption rather than isolated incidents. They asked why reform always failed and why moral renewal struggled to survive contact with authority. These questions did not yet produce revolution, but they changed intellectual ground permanently. What remained consistent was the papacy's reliance on continuity. Even as scandal accumulated, the institution emphasized its age, its survival through past crises, and its central role in European identity. This narrative reassured many, but it also masked stagnation. Endurance was mistaken for righteousness. Longevity replaced legitimacy. By now, scandal no longer shocked or surprised. It shaped expectations. Popes ruled knowing they would be criticized, doubted, and resisted. They adapted accordingly, focusing on stability over transformation. The goal was not to purify the Church, but to keep it functioning. This quiet persistence marked the true legacy of medieval papal scandal. It did not burn the institution down. It cooled it, hardened it, and reshaped it into something more defensive and less transparent. The papacy survived, but it did so by accepting imperfection as permanent rather than temporary, and this acceptance, settled deep within the structure of authority, continued to influence decisions, behavior, and belief long after the medieval world itself began to fade. As the medieval era pressed onward, the consequences of papal scandal began to sink even deeper into the daily functioning of the Church, shaping decisions in ways that were no longer consciously debated. What had once been defended or denied became routine. Corruption no longer needed justification because it no longer needed to be hidden. It existed quietly within procedure, habit, and expectation, embedded so thoroughly that removing it would have required dismantling the very systems that kept authority intact. Inside the papal administration, careers were built not on spiritual insight but on reliability within a compromised structure. Men learned quickly which questions not to ask and which issues not to raise. Advancement depended on discretion. Silence became a skill. Those who survived longest were those who understood that moral outrage was dangerous, while practical cooperation ensured longevity. Over time, this culture reproduced itself, selecting leaders shaped by caution rather than conviction. The language of reform continued to exist, but it became ceremonial. Councils issued statements condemning excess while avoiding structural change. Decrees were written with careful ambiguity, allowing enforcement to be selective. This preserved appearances while minimizing disruption. The church could claim to oppose corruption while continuing to benefit from it. This duality satisfied many who wanted stability more than transformation. Scandal also altered how justice functioned within the church. Discipline became uneven. Minor figures were punished publicly to demonstrate seriousness, while powerful offenders were protected quietly. This imbalance reinforced cynicism. Observers learned that wrongdoing mattered less than position. Authority shielded itself and morality adjusted accordingly. The papacy's relationship with time changed as well. Short-term survival replaced long-term moral vision. Decisions were made to avoid immediate crisis rather than address underlying problems. Each pope inherited unresolved tensions and passed them on, slightly heavier, slightly more entrenched. Scandal accumulated not as dramatic collapse but as weight, pressing downward through generations. Externally, Europe adjusted. Rulers learned to negotiate with Rome pragmatically, trading support for concessions. The Pope remained influential, but rarely decisive. Authority functioned through compromise rather than command. This reduced open conflict, but also reduced clarity. The Church spoke often, but its voice blended into the noise of politics. Within the population, expectations settled into realism. People no longer hoped for a pure papacy. They hoped for a manageable one. This quiet lowering of standards was one of the most profound consequences of medieval scandal. It preserved peace, but diminished aspiration. Holiness became something personal rather than institutional. This shift affected how history itself would remember the papacy. Instead of singular villains or heroes, the era produced patterns. Repetition replaced shock. Familiarity replaced outrage. Scandal became a feature rather than a failure, something anticipated whenever power concentrated too tightly. By this stage, the medieval papacy had mastered endurance. It could absorb criticism, survive conflict, and continue functioning without trust. This endurance was impressive, but it came at a cost. Authority remained, but inspiration faded. The office survived, but the image that once surrounded it no longer carried the same weight. These developments did not end medieval Christianity. They reshaped it quietly, steering belief away from centralized leadership and toward individual conscience, local practice, and intellectual questioning. The Church remained vast and powerful, but its center no longer defined its meaning in the same way, and so the story of scandal continued, not through isolated excesses, but through systems that learned how to live with contradiction, carrying it forward as part of their identity. As the medieval papacy continued along this path, the effects of long-term scandal became less about individual behavior and more about how authority learned to survive without moral clarity. The Church did not collapse under the weight of corruption because it adjusted its expectations internally. What mattered was not whether leaders embodied virtue, but whether the system continued to function. Stability became the highest value, quietly replacing holiness as the primary goal of governance. Within Rome, this adjustment could be felt in the rhythm of daily administration. Decisions were no longer framed in terms of what was right, but what was possible. Every action was measured against risk. Would this anger a powerful family? Would this provoke a king? Would this weaken alliances that kept Rome safe? Moral considerations still existed, but they were filtered through layers of caution until they lost urgency. Delay became a tool. Ambiguity became protection. This environment shaped the psychology of leadership. Popes ruled knowing they would be judged harshly by some and ignored by others. Rather than attempt radical reform that might provoke resistance, many focused on maintaining balance between rival forces. This balancing act required compromise at every turn. Compromise hardened into habit. Habit hardened into structure. Scandal also reshaped how punishment worked. The Church continued to discipline lower clergy for moral failings, reinforcing the appearance of standards, while shielding those whose removal might destabilize power networks. This selective justice taught a clear lesson. Rules existed, but they were applied differently depending on status. Over time, this lesson spread downward, influencing behavior throughout the hierarchy. The accumulation of unresolved scandal affected collective memory. Instead of recalling individual corrupt popes as exceptions, people began to view corruption as cyclical. Each new pope arrived with cautious hope, followed by resignation. This pattern dulled emotional response. Outrage gave way to expectation. Expectation gave way to disengagement. Theological thought adapted accordingly. Writers increasingly emphasized the idea that God's truth existed independently of human institutions. This allowed believers to preserve faith without defending leadership. The Church remained necessary, but it was no longer idealized. This distinction, once subtle, became increasingly explicit in sermons, letters, and academic debate. Politically, the papacy leaned further into symbolism. Rituals grew more elaborate. Titles expanded. Visual authority compensated for moral uncertainty. These displays reinforced hierarchy and continuity, reassuring those who feared chaos more than corruption. The message was not purity, but permanence. As scandal persisted, reformers faced an increasingly difficult challenge. They were not fighting individual vice, but an ecosystem that normalized it. Each reform effort threatened networks of loyalty built over decades. Resistance did not always come through open defiance. It came through delay, reinterpretation, and quiet obstruction. Change slowed until it stopped. By this stage, the medieval papacy functioned with remarkable resilience. It could endure criticism, absorb scandal, and continue operating because it no longer depended on trust alone. Law, tradition, and necessity held it together. This resilience preserved the institution, but it also froze many of its problems in place. What remained constant through all of this was contradiction. The Church preached humility while exercising power. It condemned greed while managing vast wealth. It demanded obedience while modeling compromise. These contradictions were no longer shocking. They were familiar. And familiarity, more than outrage, defined the final centuries of medieval papal scandal. As the medieval period drew closer to its end, the long history of papal scandal began to influence how future leaders were chosen and how leadership itself was imagined. Expectations had shifted so deeply that the papacy was no longer seen as an office that transformed men, but as an office that revealed them. People no longer assumed that the throne would elevate character. Instead, they assumed character would be tested, bent, and often broken by the weight of power placed upon it. Inside the conclaves, this realism shaped decision-making. Cardinals debated not only theology but temperament, alliances, and survivability. A candidate's ability to navigate politics mattered as much as his spiritual reputation. In a dangerous environment, idealism felt risky. Stability felt safer. This logic did not emerge suddenly. It developed slowly through centuries of watching what happened to popes who tried to rule purely by moral authority and failed. Once elected, popes inherited systems already compromised. They stepped into courts shaped by generations of negotiation, secrecy, and power exchange. Even well-intentioned leaders found themselves constrained by existing obligations. Debts had to be paid, alliances had to be honored, enemies had to be managed. Each compromise felt small in isolation, but together they continued the pattern that scandal had established. The public image of the papacy adjusted accordingly. Sermons spoke less about the personal holiness of popes and more about the endurance of the Church itself. The institution became the focus, not the individual. This shift allowed believers to remain loyal without defending behavior they found troubling. Faith redirected itself toward continuity rather than example. Scandal also influenced how dissent developed. Earlier critics had focused on individual corruption. Later voices spoke more about systems. They questioned whether any human authority should wield such unchecked power. These arguments did not always seek rebellion. Often they sought limits. Yet even calls for limitation were threatening to an institution built on absolute claims. The papacy responded cautiously. Some reforms were allowed, but only those that did not weaken central control. Moral language was embraced, but structural change was resisted. The appearance of renewal mattered more than its depth. This approach satisfied short-term pressure while preserving long-term dominance. By this point, the distance between Rome and ordinary believers was vast. The Pope was physically distant, culturally removed, and politically complex. Most Christians encountered faith locally, through parish priests, rituals, and community traditions. Rome existed as a symbol rather than a presence. Scandal reinforced this separation, making centralized leadership feel abstract and remote. This abstraction protected the papacy in one sense. Criticism no longer threatened immediate collapse because emotional attachment had weakened. The Church endured because it was woven into law, education, and identity. It no longer relied on admiration. It relied on necessity. Yet this endurance came with a quiet cost. Authority survived, but inspiration faded. The papacy continued to command, but it struggled to guide. Scandal had reshaped leadership into something defensive, cautious, and procedural. The fire of moral certainty dimmed, replaced by management of risk. As the medieval world prepared to move into a new era, it carried this legacy forward. The stories of scandalous popes were not forgotten. They became lessons, warnings, and points of reference. They shaped expectations before reforms ever began. They ensured that future challenges to authority would find fertile ground. And so the medieval papacy moved forward, powerful yet constrained by its own history, bearing the weight of centuries in which scandal had become not an interruption, but a defining feature of how power learned to survive. As the medieval world finally edged toward transformation, the legacy of scandal within the papacy no longer operated as a series of remembered events, but as an inherited mindset. Generations of clergy, rulers, and believers had grown up inside a church where contradiction was normal and compromise was expected. The question was no longer whether scandal existed, but how leadership functioned despite it. This shift altered the internal logic of authority in ways that were subtle but irreversible. Popes of this later period governed with an awareness shaped by history rather than idealism. They understood that trust could not be assumed, and that loyalty had to be managed carefully. This awareness encouraged caution over courage. Decisions were framed to avoid instability rather than pursue transformation. Reform was discussed endlessly, but action was measured and slow, filtered through fear of backlash from powerful families, states, and internal factions. The weight of precedent pressed heavily on every choice. Inside the papal court, routines reflected this guarded mentality. Advisors spoke carefully. Language softened hard truths. Problems were addressed indirectly or postponed. Conflict avoidance became policy. This atmosphere reduced open scandal but did not eliminate corruption. Instead, it made it quieter and more sophisticated. Power no longer flaunted excess openly as it once had. It learned discretion. The papacy's public face also changed. Instead of dramatic moral claims, official language emphasized continuity, unity, and tradition. The Church presented itself as ancient, enduring, and stable, drawing authority from its survival rather than its purity. This message resonated with societies exhausted by conflict and uncertainty. People accepted imperfection in exchange for order, yet beneath this surface, unresolved tensions continued to shape thought and belief. Scholars revisited earlier scandals, analyzing them not as moral failures alone, but as symptoms of structural imbalance. Questions emerged about concentration of power, lack of accountability, and the dangers of merging spiritual authority with political control. These questions did not immediately dismantle the system, but they lingered, shaping future debate. The memory of scandal also influenced how obedience was taught. Instead of emphasizing blind submission, clergy increasingly stressed personal conscience and intention. This subtle shift allowed believers to remain faithful without defending leadership. It was a quiet reorientation of spiritual responsibility away from Rome and toward the individual soul. What is striking about this period is how normalized contradiction had become. The Church continued to condemn corruption while practicing compromise. It continued to claim spiritual supremacy while negotiating political survival. These tensions no longer shocked. They defined the institution. Scandal ceased to be a rupture and became part of the operating environment. By this stage, the medieval papacy had achieved a form of endurance that depended less on moral authority and more on structural resilience. It could absorb criticism, survive opposition, and adapt language without changing foundations. This endurance ensured survival, but it also ensured that many of the same problems would persist into the next era. As the Middle Ages closed, the papacy stood powerful, experienced and deeply shaped by its own history of scandal. The institution had learned how to live with contradiction, how to rule without trust, and how to maintain authority without inspiration. These lessons would not disappear. They would follow the Church forward, influencing conflicts, reforms, and debates for centuries to come. As the medieval age slowly gave way to a changing world, the long story of scandal within the papacy settled into memory not as a sudden collapse, but as a quiet transformation. Centuries of contradiction had reshaped what people expected from power, from holiness, and from the men who claimed to stand between heaven and earth. The Pope remained a central figure, but no longer an unquestioned one. Authority endured, yet innocence did not. What lingered most strongly was not any single scandal, but the pattern they formed together. Power concentrated too tightly had invited compromise. Compromise repeated too often had dulled outrage. Over time, endurance replaced idealism, and survival replaced purity. The Church learned to live with this reality, and so did Europe. Faith adapted. Belief narrowed inward. Devotion found quieter paths. In this closing light, the medieval papacy appears less as a tale of villains and more as a mirror of its age. It reflected a world shaped by scarcity, violence, ambition, and fear, where even sacred offices were pulled into the gravity of politics. The scandals did not erase belief, but they changed its shape, pushing holiness away from palaces and toward personal conscience, local practice, and private hope. History does not close with judgment here. It closes with understanding. The scandalous popes of the Middle Ages were not interruptions in an otherwise pure story. They were part of the long human struggle to reconcile power with principle. Their failures taught lessons that echoed forward, preparing the ground for reform, resistance, and renewal in centuries yet to come. And as the lamps dim in Rome and the long medieval night finally softens, the story rests, not in outrage, but in reflection, leaving us with a quieter awareness of how institutions survive, how faith endures, and how history carries its truths forward, gently, patiently, and without hurry.